Okay, good afternoon. Let's get started. Thanks for joining us for our eighth and final webinar of this academic year. This webinar is presented by Behavioral Economics in Action at Rotman in partnership with the Behaviorally Informed Organization Partnership. I'm Matt Hilchey, your moderator and a postdoctoral researcher with Behavioral Economics in Action at Rotman. Behavioral Economics in Action at Rotman, or BIOrg, is a research center at the University of Toronto's Rotman School of Management, whose three programmatic missions are to research, educate, and engage in meaningful outreach with our academic, governmental, and industry partners. These monthly webinars are our way of hearing firsthand from academics and practitioners who are making a meaningful impact in the world of behaviorally informed business and evidence-based public policy. Today I'll be introducing Catherine Yeung, an associate professor of marketing at the Chinese University of Hong Kong. Before I introduce Catherine, I'd like to cover the ground rules for this webinar. Following my introduction, our speaker will deliver a 30 to 35-minute presentation. During the presentation, we'll encourage the audience to submit questions by clicking the chat tab on the right side of your WebEx screen and then typing into the entry box. These questions will be visible to all participants, and at the end of the talk, if we still have some time, I'll ask Catherine some of your questions. Without any further ado, I'd like to introduce Catherine. Before joining the faculty at the Chinese University of Hong Kong, Catherine was an associate professor at the National University of Singapore. Her main research areas are behavioral decision-making and consumer psychology. She's engaged in both academic and community-based research, specializing in the design and testing of interventions that aim to improve individual and community well-being. Her research cuts across multiple domains, including weight loss, diabetes prevention, medication adherence, transportation, and workforce development. Catherine holds a PhD in marketing and has authored articles in many of the leading academic journals. Catherine, it's my pleasure to welcome you here today. Thanks so much for joining us. I know it's midnight your time, so a special thanks are in order. But when you're all set, you can take it away.
Thank you, Matt. So I just want to make sure that you can hear me well, right? Hello?
I can hear you.
All right, okay, good. So thank you, Matt. So let us, without further ado, let me just start, all right? So, I'm going to talk about the chasm between behavioral science knowledge and behavioral science practice, and what is it and how does it affect the success of your own project. So let us start by looking at the ideal world first, right? So this is the ideal world where behavioral scientists meet practitioners. So in this ideal world, behavioral scientists are producers of knowledge, and the practitioners use this knowledge embedded into practice. Scientists design and test intervention ideas in small-scale proof-of-concept studies, and the practitioners make use of the research findings, decide on adoption and adaptation based on their own domain knowledge and frontline experience. Ideally, the two parties pursue the same common goal of developing behaviorally informed policies and practices. Okay, so this is the ideal world. But what about the reality? In the reality, incentives of the two parties don't really align perfectly. Scientists are often motivated by journal publications rather than the practitioner's need. And then the research findings that shows large effect for solving important policy problems are often more likely to be published. So when scientists conduct their proof of concept studies, they might test an idea in a context that gives the best shot of success. And then when they report the findings, they might leave out details that expose limitations of the generalizability of their findings. They might also frame an intervention idea as a promising solution capable of solving grand, complex problem, while in the reality, the intervention might only address one slice of the problem. Now, what about the practitioner side? So they are always under pressure to solve problems quick. They might yield to off-the-shelf solutions, and they might be tempted to adopt solutions from the BI literature as it is, without further testing. So these practices actually pose significant challenges to large-scale implementation. So there are many different kinds of challenges that the practitioners face when they embed behavioral science in a practice. But today, we will focus on three main challenges. The first is with problem definition. So the practitioners might find it hard to determine whether in the intervention that they learn about from behavioral science research can actually solve their problem. The second challenge is with the judgment of sample representativeness. Practitioners may not be able to judge the sample representativeness of the intervention, or more specifically, can the research participants be considered representative of my audience? Will my audience react to the nudge the same way as the research participants? The third challenge is with the judgment of situation representativeness. Specifically, is the situation I am handling similar to the one tested in the interventions? So in today's presentation, I'm going to go through each of these challenges one by one. So the first challenge is with problem definition. Well, the idea of problem definition is simple. We must know the problem and its underlying issues to be able to find a solution. Problem definition is particularly important for complex problems. When the problem is complex, we often need to break it up into smaller problems and tackle each of them or part of them in a very specific way. So this is a fundamental idea of problem definition. While the idea is deceptively simple, it is often more challenging in practice. One of the major barriers to properly define a problem is solution mindedness. When we are eager to solve a problem at hand, breaking it up into several problems slow things down and sends a signal that we are not making progress towards finding a solution. So there is this eagerness to reach a solution to a problem as given without trying to dig deep to uncover the true character of the problem. So this tendency is known as solution mindedness. The problem of solution mindedness exacerbates when scientists supply policymakers or the practitioners with quick solutions. This often happens when behavioral scientists frame an intervention idea as a solution to a grand, complex problem. And we are going to illustrate how this happens using one of the most widely adopted nudges, which is the use of reminders. Behavioral scientists praise the use of reminders as an effective and low-cost nudge. Reminders has been used in several disciplines. And we have seen medical appointment reminders, sending text messages that remind patients of their upcoming medical appointments, giving them the phone number to call for cancellation, and telling them the cost of missing appointments together can reduce missed appointments from 11.1 to 8.4%. We have also seen text payment reminders widely adopted globally. But in medical care, SMS reminders are used to remind people to take their medicines. Medication non-adherence is actually a big problem. About 30 to 50% of US adults are not adherent to long-term medications, and that results in 100 billion in preventable cost each year. A number of studies have shown that reminders improve patients' adherence to medication among patients with chronic diseases such as HIV, hypertension, and asthma. Now, suppose you are a member of a diabetes care team and you have just seen a behavioral scientist who present these impressive results, impressive use of reminders. And since you're looking for ways to improve medication adherence among patients, what do you think will be thinking now. You might start thinking about nudging medication adherence by sending your patients text messages 3 times a day to remind them to take their medicines. This sounds like a reasonable judgment. After all, that's what the research has shown. But what we might not notice is that behavioral scientists have a tendency to frame nudge research from a nudge-centric view. This is a view that frames a perspective for people to see how small changes can make a big difference. This view emphasizes on the nudge itself, the cause of the nudge, and the benefits it brings to solving grand problem. So in this case, as what you have seen from the previous slide, you would see researchers reporting that SMS reminders increase compliance from X% to Y%, and the cost of sending SMS message is very low. So it is actually a very good bet for you to send SMS reminder to try to solve the behavioral problem of skipping medicine, and hence you can solve a big policy problem of medication non-adherence. But does this nudge-centric view really capture the essence of medication non-adherence? Let's take a look. So a closer look of the contributing factors of medication non-adherence would suggest that while some people may simply mindlessly forget to take their medicine, others might skip doses intentionally. For example, diabetes patients might think that it is fine to skip medicines when they do not feel sick. So for patients who have this belief, the inconvenience and the discomfort of taking medicine might outweigh the small perceived benefits of taking medicine. And so they might intentionally skip some doses. There are also patients who dislike side effects of medicine. Some patients might skip doses to save money. So obviously, reminders can only solve one of these problems, which is when non-adherence is due to mindless forgetting. So let's call this a problem-centric view. This view includes an analysis of all the contributing factors of the problem at hand. It shows clearly that the use of reminders could at best solve part of the problem here. By taking this view, healthcare providers will come to realize that they must find out which type of patients is more common in the patient population. Is it the mindless type or the intentional type? If, let's say, a significant number of the patients know the importance of taking medicines as prescribed, but they simply forget to do so, then reminders will probably work very well. But if a significant number of their patients hold wrong beliefs of how diabetic medicines work, then an informational approach or educational approach that aims at changing beliefs will probably be more suitable. But as we mentioned, behavioral scientists do not always adopt a problem-centric view like this. In fact, a meta-analysis that examined 13 studies using reminders to improve medication adherence, none of the studies differentiated between mindless and deliberative non-adherence. So it is easy for practitioners to draw a simple conclusion that reminders work to solve medication non-adherence, but in fact, it only solves mindless non-adherence. So this is how I see the challenge with problem definition. Okay, so behavioral scientists often frame behavioral interventions as solutions to grand policy problems. These solutions will be very attractive to the practitioners who are solution-minded and eager to reach their solutions. If scientists do not tie an intervention idea to a specific contributing factor, but instead frame it as a solution to a general problem, we can imagine that it is very tempting for a solution-minded practitioners to adopt the intervention without going through a detailed problem definition process. So we can see that it is actually not just the practitioner's problem that they don't go through a problem definition stage. All right, it is actually both sides. Both sides are sort of responsible for this tendency to skip the problem definition stage. So to solve this problem, we need both parties' effort. The behavioral scientists will really need to be very specific in presenting which part of a problem they're not just address. And practitioners must commit to a problem definition stage of a project. They should always decompose a complex problem and drill down to a very specific behavioral issues to be tackled. And understand that a given intervention can at best address only part of a broader problem. Well, although a solution sounds very narrow when it can only address part of a problem, we must learn to embrace this kind of narrowness of a behavioral solution because specificity is really the key to get problems solved. So let us now move on to the second challenge, sample representativeness. The judgment of sample representativeness entails answering the question, can research participants be considered representative of my audience? Would my population react the same way to a nudge as those in the original study? Well, indeed, humans can potentially vary along many dimensions, and it is rare for a nudge to have the same effect on all kinds of people. But many practitioners may start off by assuming that the research participants are representative of the population unless they see obvious signs that suggest otherwise. So we are going to illustrate this using two examples. So the first example, it's a public-wide adoption of iron-fortified salts in India. Iron-fortified salt was found to reduce anemia among adolescents in several trials. So the India's National Institute of Nutrition and the Indian government granted license to produce iron-fortified salts and issued a policy to encourage public-wide adoptions of iron-fortified salt. So what was the assumption behind this large-scale implementation? Well, the assumption is that iron-fortified salt is equally effective in reducing anemia in the wider population. But a large-scale experiment subsequently found an increase in hemoglobin only among adolescents, but not in any other groups. So the fortified salt actually had no effect on policy goal of reducing anemia for the general public. But this finding was very disappointing since lots of the investments and resources have been put forward to the formulation, the production, the public-wide distribution of iron-fortified salt. But yet another example comes from the domain of pharmaceutical testing. Women of childbearing age are often excluded from participation in drug trials because of the concerns of reproductive adverse effects. Therefore, historically, women's involvement in clinical trials for prescription drugs has been very limited, and prescription drugs have been mostly tested on men. Only until recently, pharmaceutical scientists point out systematic gender differences in drug response and so the importance of understanding gender difference in pharmaceutical research. So these two examples show that we cannot simply assume that our audience are going to react the way research participants do. So let us dig a little deeper to find out what factors could lead to sample unrepresentativeness so that we have a better sense of what the issue is. So there are three major contributing factors, that contribute to sample unrepresentativeness. The first one is the scientist biased choice of subject samples. As we have discussed at the beginning of the presentation, scientists might seek out a specific research sample that will benefit significantly from an intervention in order to yield more promising treatment effects. So that is known as the let's skip the idea is best short of working sort of approach. The second source of bias is research constraints on the ability to assess representative samples. Well, the pharmaceutical example that we have mentioned just now was one of these examples. And another example is perhaps this Group's 2008 groundbreaking study that examined the use of financial incentives to promote weight loss. In that study, 94.7% of the participants were actually males because the study was conducted in a Veterans Affairs Medical Center. So would this incentive on weight loss work equally well on females? We hope so, but this is still an open question. The third contributing factor of sample unrepresentativeness is known as volunteer bias. We must understand that people are fundamentally not interested in participating in scientific research unless they can drive meaningful benefits from their own participation. These benefits could be money in the form of participation fee or some kind of potential positive outcomes of the intervention. So people who volunteer to sign up and to participate in research projects could be more concerned with the issue being studied than the rest of the population. For example, people who volunteer to sign up for an RCT that tests the effects of incentives on exercise are more likely to be already convinced by the benefits of exercise but need a little bit of help getting started. They represent only a small subset of the wider population that also include people who think exercise is not for them. So what can practitioners do to ensure sample representativeness? Currently, the consolidated standards of reporting trials guidelines required scientists to report subjects' characteristics in their research paper. This includes information on gender, age, income, race, and other social economic information of the sample. But even with such information at hand, it would be challenging for practitioners to determine the nature and the extent of sample unrepresentativeness. But let's consider again an example from pharmaceutical domain. For a long, long time, doctors and pharmacists have already known that pharmaceutical trial participants are mostly males, but they don't seem to have questioned the generalizability of the findings to females until recently when we are widely aware of the possible connection between gender and medication effects. So sometimes providing this information might not necessarily help us judge the nature and extent of unrepresentativeness bias. So to truly tackle the issue, economists and public policy experts strongly recommend policymakers and practitioners to subject a behavioral intervention idea to a stage 2 trial, which is a trial conducted by the organization in the community that is representative of where an intervention would eventually be implemented. So now let me move on to talk about the last challenge, which is situation representativeness. Situation representativeness entails asking the question, is the situation in which the intervention was originally tested similar to the one that I am handling in front of me? A situation encapsulates a collection of variables, so it is very challenging for practitioners to anticipate whether any of those variables are going to interfere with an intervention. So let us illustrate this challenge using an example of a pedagogical approach known as the teaching at the right level, TARL, designed by an NGO in India. The basic idea of TARL was to organize children by their level of knowledge, but not according to their age, and match the teaching to the level to the students. It works very well in the proof of concept study, but when TARL was integrated with the government school system, its overall effect size was a lot smaller. One interesting observation was that it did work when it was made part, it did not work when it was made part of the regular school term, but it worked very well when it was implemented outside school hours, like in a summer camp. So it turns out that in the regular school year, there was strong resistance from parents and teachers against TARL due to their emphasis on covering grade level curriculum during formal school hours. But the teachers and parents were a lot more receptive to the idea in summer camp when there was no formal curriculum to follow. So in the TARL example, the results differed dramatically when the situation changes from regular school term to summer camp. But obviously, this situation encapsulates a number of variables, including the teachers' and the parents' expectation, learning goals, and whether there has been a formal curriculum to follow. It would be almost impossible to fully anticipate the influence of all these factors or all these variables due to the complexity of real life setting. Well, the contributing factors of situation representativeness are pretty much very similar to those of sample representativeness. They could be the scientist's choice of RCT situations or research constraints. But the situation representativeness is probably even harder to handle than sample unrepresentativeness because a lot of variables are wrapped in a context. So once again, conducting a stage 2 trial will really help to identify any hidden issues in the situations before large-scale implementation. So today we have talked about 3 challenges we must overcome to achieve successful implementation of behavioral interventions. Well, I have also discussed the different work styles, different incentives of academic scientists and practitioners. But to conclude, I want to use an analogy from marketing. In marketing, we think it is important for consumers to know the incentives of people who try to do business with them, but because this knowledge will help the consumers make better purchase decisions. I think this applies to the behavioral science too. So if, let's say, if we say that nudge is a powerful tool to improve decisions, then I think behavioral scientists are like passionate salespersons who promote the tool as powerful, economical, and user-friendly. Then the practitioners are the excited and enthusiastic consumer who go ahead to use the tool without going through the details of the user manual. So there are a lot of blind spots that leads to frustrations and ineffective use of behavioral science. So I hope that what we have discussed today will help practitioners uncover these blind spots and slowly learn to be a smart consumer of behavioral science by following the few suggestions that we give in today's presentation. So this ends my presentation for today. If you are interested in reading more about today's topic, here are some of the references. I believe BIOrg will upload this presentation onto their website afterwards. Then you can take a look on these references and check out these references to learn, to know a little bit more about the topic.
Catherine,
Yeah.
thanks so much for your insight today. I really appreciate your coming on the show at the time you did.
My pleasure. Anyway, after a few months working from office, where we started in February, we have actually lost a sense of time. So this is actually fine.
Yeah, this is nothing to you. You're used to this now. All right, Catherine, I'll be talking with you later. To the audience, I'll let you know that a full recording of this webinar will be available at our website, and you can get that by clicking on the side tab labeled Events, and then clicking on the sub tab labeled BIOrg Webinar Series. Thank you, everybody, for attending. We're looking forward to seeing you again next season, and you can exit this webinar by closing your WebEx screen. Thanks.